History as it happens, April 25th, 2023. A decent interval.
Why are these realities our concern? Why are we in South Vietnam?
Well, it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
The question at issue is not whether Johnson's war becomes Nixon's war. The great question is, how can we win America's peace?
And by common agreement between us and the North Vietnamese, we are today...
Throughout the years of negotiations, we have insisted on peace with honor. In the settlement that has now been agreed to, all the conditions that I laid down then have been met.
50 years ago, in the Paris Peace Accords, the U.S. agreed to pull the last of its forces out of Vietnam. A phony peace that was actually a U.S. defeat, followed by the fall of Saigon 2 years later. 20 years after the humiliating results of Nixon's peace with honor, the U.S. and Vietnam restored relations. Peace and reconciliation were possible after all, just not the way the war makers imagined. But it does have something to teach us in our age of forever wars and intractable conflicts. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
America can regain the sense of pride that existed before Vietnam. But it cannot be achieved by refighting a war that is finished as far as America is concerned.
Today I am announcing the normalization of diplomatic relationships with Vietnam.
What are our national interests here? Can we be clear on what those are? What are the political objectives behind the use of military force or sanctions or other policies that we're putting forward? And do we understand the culture and history behind it? So those are questions I think if we apply to other contexts, we might be able to find a path to normalization.
January 1973, a couple weeks after the start of his second term, President Richard Nixon looked into Americans' living rooms from the Oval Office and delivered the peace with honor he'd been promising since inheriting the Vietnam War 4 years earlier.
To the leaders of North Vietnam, as we have ended the war through negotiations, let us now build a peace of reconciliation. For our part, we are prepared to make a major effort to help achieve that goal.
Everyone who signed the Paris Peace Accords knew there'd be no peace. The U.S. did agree to withdraw its troops, but the North Vietnamese army remained in the south, and its leaders did not drop their determination to crush the regime in Saigon. Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger knew the South probably would not hold out for long once U.S. forces were gone. They simply did not want to catch the blame for it, as they made clear in a conversation in August 1972, recorded on Nixon's taping system.
This favor, due to the fact that I feel that the North Vietnamese are so badly hurt.
South Vietnam probably is never going to survive anyway, says Nixon. We also have to realize, Henry, that winning an election is terribly important. It's terribly important this year, but can we have a viable foreign policy if a year from now or 2 years from now, North Vietnam gobbles up South Vietnam?
Guarantees so that they aren't, looking at the foreign policy process.
Kissinger responds, yes, if it looks as if it's the result of South Vietnamese incompetence. So, he says, we've got to find some formula that holds the thing together a year or two. After a year, Mr. President, Vietnam will be a backwater. If we settle it, say, this October, by January 74, no one will give a damn.
This holds the thing together a year or two. After a year, Mr. President, Vietnam will be a backwater. If we settle it, say, this October, by January 74, no one will give a damn.
And their decent interval lasted 2 years, I suppose, until April 1975, when Saigon fell to the communists.
The city of Saigon was renamed today. The victorious communists who forced the city's surrender said the capital of South Vietnam henceforth will be known as Ho Chi Minh City.
A couple months back, the U.S. Institute of Peace here in Washington hosted an event with diplomats and historians reflecting on the Paris Peace Accords 50 years on. And on the way, the U.S. and Vietnam healed the war's wounds, establishing normal diplomatic relations in 1995. Andrew Wells Dong, who leads the Institute's peacebuilding initiative between the two nations, will join us a bit later in the podcast to talk about how this reconciliation might be applied to other conflicts today. But first, what about the phony peace deal itself and the lessons not learned from the war that supposedly taught us so many enduring ones, like the folly of fighting wars in far-off places where we don't understand the language or culture against an army of national liberation? The idea that we can stamp legitimacy onto an illegitimate regime, as was the regime in Saigon, to the people of South Vietnam. That overwhelming air power and massive violence can subdue a determined foe. What about the lesson of not prolonging a war for years in order to avoid a humiliating defeat that may be unavoidable in the long run anyway, as the U.S. learned in Afghanistan after 20 years of futility? Carolyn Eisenberg is a historian at Hofstra University. Decades ago, she was an anti-war activist. More recently, as in this year, she is the author of Fire and Rain, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Wars in Southeast Asia. Carolyn Eisenberg, welcome to the podcast.
Well, and thank you for inviting me.
So I guess the right place to begin when we're talking about the Paris Peace Accords was they were not peace accords.
I mean, what they were, in reality, was an agreement between the United States and North Vietnam, even though there are two other signatories to the agreement. But the thing that mattered really was the U.S. North Vietnamese understanding. And basically it was an understanding that said that there might be a ceasefire, and there should be a ceasefire, and that the United States would withdraw its last combat troops, and most critically from Nixon's point of view, get the POWs home. Had become a bigger and bigger issue as the point of the war gets harder and harder to see, like, why are these people being kept prisoners? That's what the agreement did. It got the U.S. troops out. It got the POWs to come home. One of the things that the North Vietnamese had been demanding for a long time was the removal of the Thieu government before they would sign anything. And so that's one place where they actually changed their position. They were willing to have an agreement with the Thieu government in place, at least temporarily.
Thieu, he was the military leader of South Vietnam, or he had been in the military, and not to digress too much about this, but after the toppling of Ngo Dien Diem, when Kennedy was president, South Vietnam went through a whole number of governments until the U.S. finally settled on Thieu.
And Thieu had actually provided, some level of stability. But just to go back to your original question, I think it was very clear to all of the principals that once the United States was out of there, that the war would go on, that the conflict between North and South Vietnam would go forward, and as well the what remained of the National Liberation Front, that they would continue their efforts in South Vietnam. So I don't think anybody had the expectation that this was going to be the end, that people were going to live in peace and prosperity. I think there was an issue about how long a ceasefire might hold, and that was not so clear. I think that Nixon and Kissinger were optimistic that it would hold for some amount of time, at least several months. So that was kind of up in the air, but that the fight would continue was not a secret to anybody.
To my question about whether these were peace accords, that was the illusion, though, that Nixon and Kissinger wanted to sell to the American people. And we're going to get to how they arrive at this deal in late 72, early 73 is when it's actually finalized, and whether or not they could have gotten that same deal in 1969. So why don't we backtrack then to when Nixon takes office? What is his and Kissinger's assessment of the war at that point? Do they, at this early stage, at least in their management of the war, determine the U.S. can't win?
No, they don't determine that. But it's a very good question. And I want to expand right away a little bit of perspective on this, because they're very powerful people, Nixon and Kissinger. But they're not doing things just on their own, like they have these ideas and nobody else does. They're, in many ways, these are two people who are conformists. They had gotten where they are because Kissinger, was very accepting of the whole idea of nuclear weapons, and obviously Nixon had been a Cold Warrior. But these are not people that were like thinking outside the box. And I'm saying that because what's really important to understand is that when they come in, within the United States government, there was almost no sentiment whatsoever for ending the war. And that's really important. And the military in particular, and I'm thinking both of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the one hand and military headquarters in South Vietnam on the other, they all are saying really that Tet Offensive has been a disaster for North Vietnam, and that if the United States would just press forward and continue, and if anything, expand what they were doing, that this could come to a positive resolution. Weirdly, Kissinger has Daniel Ellsberg do a whole questionnaire that goes to all the bureaucracies with about a zillion questions about, how they're all assessing things, which he wanted to know. And there's no sentiment to speak of within any of those institutions for the U.S. pulling out. And there's not really sentiment for what you're talking about, Martin, which is important, which is they're not saying to Kissinger, well, in the end, we're going to lose. That's not the message to him. So I think in understanding what Nixon and Kissinger did at first, it's really important to understand that they were acting in a way that was consistent with what the national bureaucracies were telling them.
Nixon had already shown his potential for deceitful dealings when it came to the war in the Chennault affair of 1968 when he was running for office. Is that significant at all as we start to talk about 1969 when he's actually in power and can do something about the war?
Well, just to clarify for your listeners, what happens, Lyndon Johnson, once he withdraws from the race.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Has committed to trying to get negotiations going with the North Vietnamese. And I think from pretty early on, four-sided negotiations, including the NLF, as well as the government of South Vietnam. So that's what Johnson is doing. He sent Harriman over there in Paris to try to get that going. They're having a lot of snags even before the official negotiations are going to start. They're fighting over the table, which is really ridiculous. Finally, in October, it appears that they now have enough of an agreement to get the official negotiations started. For Nixon, this is very alarming. He's got inside information, including from Kissinger, about what's going on. Because if, in fact, 2 or 3 days before the election or 5 days before the real negotiations get going, that's going to be a big boost for Humphrey.
And Humphrey was picking up ground on him, too.
Absolutely. Every day, Humphrey was gaining more votes. It was, getting very, very close. And of course, Nixon also had the trauma of losing to Jack Kennedy in a race which maybe he didn't even really lose if you think about Chicago and how crooked they are. So there's going to be this great announcement that the real negotiations are starting. Nixon sees this as a problem. His people, who had opened up lines of communication to the South Vietnamese beforehand, basically say to the South Vietnamese government, if you refuse to participate right now, Nixon, if he becomes president, I'll give you a better deal. And that actually happens. There's different views about that. Sometimes historians blow this up.
And they say that the war would have ended had it not been for it. That's not true.
Would never. But, they were miles away from an agreement, really.
That's right.
Which becomes evident, in fact, once real negotiations get started.
That's right.
So it's not like that was really close.
Yeah, the point is the subterfuge that Nixon was engaged
in. What it shows is that he has no scruples at all. That he's a complete liar. And, with the lying in that little episode, prefigures bigger lies later on. So it doesn't speak well for his personal integrity. But the claim that somehow or other he, made the war go on much longer or any of that, I don't really think is true.
And it was called the Chennault affair because of Anna Chennault, who was the widow of Claire Chennault from the Flying Tigers during World War II. There are some excellent books about this subject that people can find. So we're going to move on back to 1969 here, Carolyn Eisenberg. So you've already argued that Nixon, when he takes office, does not believe the war is unwinnable, and the U.S. government is committed to trying to see the war through to a positive ending, which means the survival of South Vietnam. So then what was the point of Vietnamization? I just listened to Nixon's long televised address from the Oval Office, November 1969, so 9 months into his first term, where he outlines the point of basically turning the war, the fighting of the war, over to the South Vietnamese.
The defense of freedom is everybody's business, not just America's business. And it is particularly the responsibility of the people whose freedom is threatened. In the previous administration, we Americanized the war in Vietnam. In this administration, we are Vietnamizing the search for peace.
One thing I want to put in to this discussion, which I think is actually quite important, is I want to go back to negotiations, okay, which then do get started. The four power negotiations in Paris get started when he becomes the president. But at the point in time when Nixon becomes president, he is really not clear what you could achieve diplomatically. It's really an unknown. There's still some thinking on Nixon's part that you could actually get the North Vietnamese government to basically agree to mutual withdrawal, some acceptance of the South Vietnamese government. There's some thought that they can achieve that at the table. So that's going to get played out initially. Then they also have another idea, which emerges very clearly in this new documentary, this PBS documentary, The Movement and the Madman.
I saw that. It was excellent, yeah.
They were just aired on PBS. So there's initially thought, well, maybe you can just get them to be more flexible than Johnson did, right? So there's that.
You were in that documentary, weren't you?
Yes, right.
Yes, that's right. While I watched that, I remember saying to myself, oh, yes, I'm about to speak to her. But go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt. Yeah, go ahead.
I know, but they took all of our faces out, So if you don't know what your own voice sounds like, could be anybody talking. Yeah. And let me just back up for a second. So, this initial thing about can the negotiation string actually play out? And that's very important. And then as it's becoming clear that that's not very likely, or then it's not likely they're going to get a result that, would be acceptable, then they're very interested in doing something to really scare Hanoi. That something is never fully settled, but it's probably going to be significant bombing of Hanoi, the mining of the harbors, the things that they did later to scare Hanoi to making a better deal. So that, as the film shows you, is disrupted. And one very important reason for that is the moratorium. It's the peace movement. But I want to go back because I think there's a larger dynamic here that has not been adequately recognized. And this goes to your question about Vietnamization, right? So what is Vietnamization? It's most significant, I think, is a decision to start taking American troops out of Vietnam, which is a big change, right? From Kennedy to Johnson, they keep adding more and more. Now they're going to start taking troops out with the hope that by building up the army of South Vietnam, that minimally it can forestall, if not prevent, a victory by the communists. So that's what they're doing. But I want to really highlight that this whole policy of taking troops out is initiated in the summer of '69 and keeps going until the end of the first administration. That policy itself the military hates it. It's really the person who's pushing it like crazy is Secretary of Defense Laird, who really unknown to anybody is like a secret dove here. I mean, he never stops pushing for that. But I think to understand it, I think one of the things that does need to be included is this is the peace movement. Even more than what happens in October, November, is the ongoing pressure of the peace movement creates a situation where Nixon has to demonstrate that he's ending the war, that he can't do what Johnson did. And so Nixon's problem is going to be, I have to take these troops out and I can't stop. Maybe I'll make it 40,000 instead of 50,000, play with the numbers. But basically, I have to take U.S. troops out. And so then the question for Nixon is, if I'm doing that, how are we going to win? How are we going to get an outcome that will make it clear there was a reason for this whole enterprise? And how is that going to happen? And I think that becomes a problem. But I think a lot of times people don't take seriously that the removal of troops is a very central part of this story.
because the American people were no longer going to tolerate the types
Correct.
of casualties. So year by year, the U.S. Marines land at Da Nang, the airfield there in 65. During that year, the U.S. lost about 2,000 men in Vietnam, climbs to 6,300 the following year, 11,000 in 67, 16,000 in 68, and then in 69, 11,000 casualties. 1970, it drops to 6,000 because, as you say, the U.S. is in the process of Vietnamization, and by 71, 2,400 U.S. casualties. And then in 1972, less than 1,000. So that 1969 speech, and I'm glad you brought up how the four-party talks, the peace talks, are starting right as Nixon gets into office in early 69. So in that November speech, he's talking about how the peace talks have been going on and they've produced no results at all. Of course, ever deceitful, Nixon does not mention that he's secretly threatening to bomb North Vietnam with nukes, right, to try to scare them into surrendering or whatever. But he also makes reference, Carolyn, to secret negotiations that are going on.
That is why, in addition to the public statements and negotiations, I have explored every possible private avenue that might lead to a settlement.
This is important to understand how they finally get to the agreement in 72. When do those bilateral secret negotiations between Kissinger and his North Vietnamese counterparts begin?
Yeah, it starts in July of 69. So that's sort of the beginning, and I would say there's sort of ongoing communication. The really serious negotiations between Kissinger and Le Duc Cho really get underway a little bit later in January. But I want to come back to that November speech. What it reflects right at that moment is, again, the impact of the moratorium, which is that it has interfered with this idea of just intimidating Hanoi into surrendering. But Nixon is really taking seriously the need to really clip the wings of the anti-war movement. That November speech is a major effort. He wrote most of it. And I don't know if anybody's mentioned this to you, and of course I can't put my hands on the document, but that speech is part of a whole game plan that's worked out that has 12 parts to it about how you're going to use that speech to try to turn the tide of public opinion, which they absolutely feel that going against them. And they have elaborate preparations. Just as one example of what I'm telling you, is they set up in advance networks of people across the country to start flooding the White House with excited responses after he gives his speech. So it's presented to the public later as, oh my God, people are so enthusiastic and excited by the speech. But actually, that was really prearranged. They have prearranged plan for important people to call the networks immediately after the speech to get on their case about how are they covering it, are they giving it adequate attention, etc. And the list of things goes on. So there's the speech, which I actually, if you're in the anti-war movement back then, which I was, everybody hated the speech and nobody really listened to it in the anti-war movement, right? But we were wrong, because that was the start of Nixon stepping up his campaign to try to get the public back on his side, and also to try to mute the effect of the upcoming moratorium, which is scheduled for November 15th. So it's not just like an isolated thing. And actually, let me just throw in one last thing, is Agnew. This is really when they released Agnew to go after the media. And that's not an accident either, because among the things that they're mad about is that the October 15th moratorium had gotten tremendous press. Many journalists were there. Time magazine had a big spread. I mean, just major publications went all out and were very sympathetic to it. They wanted to make sure that wouldn't happen again. So spinning off of November 3 is also the decision to put Agnew out to get on the media.
The nattering nabobs of negativism.
Correct.
Or whatever,
and
whatever said.
What's interesting is when he gives a speech and he does a number of things to make people worry about the media. And of course, the media heads all say, we're never going to be intimidated, blah, blah, blah. But in actuality, their coverage of November 15th as compared to October 15th is completely different.
And those are the two different moratoria or strikes or major peace demonstrations. There was one in October, then another in November.
That's
what you're
right.
referring
And the
to.
one in November, the level of coverage is totally different.
Much more
and
negative.
even though the numbers are actually bigger in November 15th than they were on October 15th, these media heads who had sworn that they weren't being affected at all were. You know, and the other thing that Nixon does in October 15th, one of the things that was a big problem for them is that these events around the country were very peaceful. You know, this was not, some weird hippie thing. You know, all kinds of people participated.
A cross-section of American society.
Absolutely. You know, people never protested before. It's very dignified. So one of the other pieces of this was that was disappointing to Nixon because he felt like, the more rambunctious and confrontational the marches are, better for their side. So one of the crazy things is for November 15th, there's another group I think they call themselves the Conspiracy. And they applied for permission and they get it right away. And there is, some militant action at the Justice Department, pretty ineffective, pretty small that's happening. But the media has been encouraged to cover that, even though that's a very small fraction of what's really going on, And so that, again, is part of this whole White House offensive.
The silent majority.
So tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. I pledged in my campaign for the presidency to end the war in a way that we could win the peace.
I will say that we often look back at Vietnam and think of all the people who opposed it and the peace movement, but there were plenty of other Americans who were also unhappy with Vietnam, but they wanted the U.S. to do more to win the war, right? So it was an unpopular war, but that unpopularity cut in different directions. So, Carolyn, all you're describing here, the manufacturing of the popularity of the Nixon speech, getting people to write into the networks or write the White House, this sounds like an administration that knows it can't win a war, but is trying to stage manage a U.S. withdrawal so they don't get blamed for the loss.
Well, yes, that's true. But again, I think the question, at what point do they realize they can't win?
That's the key.
Right. That among historians remains a very contested point. And part of why it's a complex subject is what is winning? That you're going to be guaranteeing for the next 500 years that, only people we like get to be in office in South Vietnam. What would be a win? And I think that there is actually uncertainty. I'm saying that as opposed to what some other historians might say about knowing they were always going to lose and it was just a decent interval. I don't think that that's quite true. I think that there was some hope, for example, that the South Vietnamese military that was being built, they were building it up to 1 million people, that somehow or other that would turn out to be more effective. By the time I would say after the invasion of Cambodia, I think that there was much more recognition of the unlikelihood that you were going to have a clear win. But on the other hand, there's a lot of gray area between it, right? And you can call it a decent interval, but you're trying to get out of the war in a way that doesn't make you look like a loser. It's sort of like Joe Biden read backwards, right? We don't want to be Joe Biden. We don't want to be those people that there's a mess, at the end.
Invasion of Cambodia, 1970. Well, clearly, my reading of the record, obviously I'm not an expert. You know the record better than I do. But had Nixon and Kissinger or the Nixon administration tried to get a peace deal right off the bat on Hanoi's terms, in their view, it would have jeopardized Nixon's reelection because the South would have been gone, wiped off the map by the 72 elections. So then once it's getting now pushed closer to Election Day 4 years later, they're looking for that decent interval. I want to return to decent interval in a bit. We'll linger here in the late 60s, early 70s for another moment or two before we get to the peace accords themselves. I want to return to the secret negotiations between Kissinger and his Vietnamese counterparts, North Vietnamese. What was the point of those secret negotiations if there were public four-party talks taking place in Paris?
I think actually the answer to that is relatively straightforward, or it's something sneaky being relatively straightforward, if that could be said, because a big concern for Kissinger in particular, but also Nixon, is they hate the State Department. They don't like them at all. And the negotiations that are going on in Paris involve the State Department. So that just in and of itself, was disqualifying. Apart from a kind of general perspective that if two people are having a private conversations that are not going on the record, that you have a chance of getting a better deal. Really, Kissinger realizes relatively early that the piece of the American position of wanting mutual withdrawal, that's not going to happen. That you're going to have to make a peace agreement with some number of North Vietnamese troops in the South. Now, nobody's actually figured this out exactly, but the number of North Vietnamese troops in the South is variable. So what that's going to mean at any given moment could really change. A fair amount of the time, you've got North Vietnamese troops that have gone back over the DMZ into North Vietnam, or they're, over the border in Cambodia. I mean, part of the reason for Cambodia was, in fact, that there were North Vietnamese troops there. I remember as the anti-war movement, we thought that was made up also, but it actually wasn't. I mean, that's what
the Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through that area. So.
If you could inflict significant losses on the North Vietnamese who were on the Cambodian side of the border, that would be actually, a win. So at the time, a lot of anti-war people said, they're just trying to take over another country. I said that, so I'm not saying they had that view. And when Nixon said, there's a lot of North Vietnamese troops there, people were like, oh, no, not really. But there were. I mean, part of what makes the deal in January, so problematic is that that's happening at a point in time that there are a lot of North Vietnamese troops in the South, which is variously estimated between maybe 140,000 to 170,000. And there were that many there because you'd had a spring offensive in 1972, which had been inconclusive, but had all those troops in the South. Which, from the point of view of the South Vietnamese government, was a disaster that those troops were staying.
January of 73 is what you're referring to.
Right.
Yeah.
That as of the spring of 72, after you've had this very major North Vietnamese offensive on the ground.
They tried to win the war with that offensive.
They did, and they didn't succeed. In some ways, the results were disappointing to them. But the other side of it is that there were a lot more North Vietnamese troops in the South as of the second part of 1972. There's a lot more there. Kissinger ignoring that in the agreement, or unable to get that changed. From the South Vietnamese point of view, it's really a betrayal. That's where the betrayal comes.
Max Hastings, in his massive and excellent book on Vietnam, writes, "In truth, the U.S. eventually settled on the only terms North Vietnam cared about, whereby its own troops remained in the South while the Americans went home." He says the other provisions in the final accords were as such that neither side would observe them. And that's why one of my first questions, maybe I didn't frame it very well, was they could have gotten this deal in 69. If the idea of a decent interval wasn't on Nixon's and Kissinger's mind in the beginning of his first term, it certainly was as Election Day is approaching in 1972. And there's a conversation, we have it on tape. It's in August of 72, where Nixon and Kissinger are talking about how long South Vietnam will hold out once the U.S. leaves. And I want you to, if you could, put this into context for me. Nixon and Kissinger are talking. Kissinger basically says, well, by 74, no one will give a damn.
After a year, Mr. President, Vietnam will be a backwater. If we settle, let's say, this October, by January 74, no one will give a damn.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like they go back and forth a little bit. I mean, one of the pitfalls, in a way, of the tapes in particular is that, you could look at things and here they are saying these absolutely terrible things and think, okay, well, that's the real truth. I have it. I've nailed it. But, the fact is that the two of them, like other people, like they deceive themselves. They deceive each other, which is really ridiculous. But
yeah, Kissinger likes to compliment his boss a lot.
Well, right, but they do deceive themselves. I do want to just go back for one second. I don't think I would quite agree with the idea that they could have had exactly this deal early on. Early on, the North Vietnamese are saying they're not signing an agreement that is going to leave Thieu in power.
That's right. They wanted the overthrow of the South Vietnamese regime.
So they did, in fact, for the January 73 agreement, right? They did, in fact, for the time being. But they have a hard time accepting it. I mean, I think that may, in fact, be a place where the influence of the Chinese or the Russians may have also come in there with the Chinese saying to them, in effect, get the Americans out. That's the important thing. Keep your eye on the ball. Stop fussing about it. But that is really a change. And I want to just go back, that you can sort of follow the ins and outs of the diplomacy. And there's a lot there that's questionable and so forth. But really the tragedy here is people are dying. Sometimes, oddly enough, historians kind of lose track of that while they're going through all these machinations about exactly what clause they're going to put in or take out, first of all, young Americans are dying. Now, that gets reduced by their troop withdrawal policy, right? But the troop withdrawal doesn't happen in a significant way till you're in probably year 3. So you've got American kids that are over there that are dying, and you're having Cambodia be destroyed as a viable society. I mean, they just destroyed Cambodia.
Secret bombing.
And Laos. And, the level of bombing, that was taking place in South Vietnam, let alone what they eventually do in the North. They're killing people. Civilians are dying. You have millions of refugees. You have a society that's all torn up. So that's, in a way, the important substrate, I think, of this diplomacy, is that the two of them are really indifferent to anything that's going to happen to Asians. They're not totally indifferent about American men. But even there, they get upset that the POW wives are impatient, right? They're always trying to get them to be quiet. I think we can easily lose, under all the diplomatic back and forth, the absolute indifference of them and many of their colleagues to the fact that these various military things that they're doing are destroying the lives of literally millions of people.
That's what makes the tapes and this whole ordeal so outrageous, in my view. Nixon and Kissinger are playing games with people's lives, where they're more concerned about not having a disaster unfold before the 1972 election, push it off, have a decent interval. If and when the South collapses, it can be blamed on South Vietnamese incompetence and not on our cynical, self-serving policies, because we know all along we need to get out of there. You're right, it would have been hard to strike this deal in '69. No U.S. president wants to surrender and lose a war. But the U.S. did not belong in Vietnam, and while the North Vietnamese government may have been wretched and Stalinist and communist, it was their country.
It was their country. And I think, one of the things that's sort of interesting as a subtext of the conversations between Nixon and Kissinger is the reality is the morale of the enemy is much higher than the morale of our allies. And that's actually something that both of them realize. Nixon is perplexed by this. And there's some really interesting conversations where basically Nixon says, why is it that their people are fighting and are so much more dedicated than our people? How did that happen? And of course, an important part of how that happened is because the United States is a foreign country in somebody else's country, which seems like it's really obvious, but it wasn't obvious to them. And even, like General Abrams, Creighton Abrams, who's in charge of military activity for most of that time, Abrams himself was also mystified at the zeal of the people that he's fighting. Like, why could this be true? But the answer, which I think, Martin, is what you're getting to, is we're foreigners in somebody else's country. It would really have been fortunate if our country's leaders had learned that, so that maybe they wouldn't be in Afghanistan and they wouldn't be in Iraq. Over and over again, what emerges is you can't have military power that is going to just control everything, when you don't even speak the language of the people that you're occupying.
And for a time, this was the lesson the U.S. tried to impart on the French when the U.S. was bankrolling the French war effort in Vietnam. For a while, U.S. officials said, well, when this is all over, you have to grant the Vietnamese their independence. And the French response was, then what the heck are we fighting for? We're trying to reimpose colonial rule. So late 72, there's a draft agreement between Kissinger and Le Duc Tho that they're able to wave around before the election. And then the accords are finalized in 1973, but these were not peace accords. When does the fighting resume in 73?
Well, it resumes almost immediately. It's really the South Vietnamese, started to fight first. There's some evidence that the North Vietnamese would, in fact, for their purposes, prefer to wait. both because it reduces the danger of further intervention by the U.S., maybe increases the likelihood that they'll actually get some aid, and also because what is true is that their military had, sustained significant damage back in 72 with their offensive. So reasonable evidence that they might have been willing to wait longer, but they don't entirely have a choice. But Martin, if I could just go back real quick again about the agreement, because I think one thing we also don't want to forget is the Christmas bombing. So that what happens is these negotiations are going on in Paris. Back in October, Kissinger thinks he has a deal with Les Docteurs and says peace is at hand.
He announced it very excitedly.
He announced it. And the anti-war movement, one of the things about doing research as a historian is finding out what are the things we thought back then were, accurate, and what are the things that we really were wrong about. And so that was, a lot of people say, oh, that's a fraud, but it isn't. He thought he had a deal. And then the South Vietnamese blow it up. Nixon doesn't want to force the situation before the election in November, so it sort of hangs in the air. And after the election, the South Vietnamese continue to object. Kissinger tries to make some concessions to them. So then the North Vietnamese become more annoying and more obstructive themselves. And as of December 11th, things are still somewhat unsettled. But I'm telling this elaborate story because I want to really get to the Christmas bombing and how that fits. So
and that's after the election. Nixon's already won re-election.
He's won re-election.
In a landslide.
Yes. And, there's another thing that happens, which we haven't touched on at all, which is that in that election, more anti-war Congress people are elected than had been there in the first place. And so it's also relevant that Nixon's allies like Goldwater and Stennis and Gerald Ford come and tell him a week later, when this new Congress comes in, you're not getting any more money. So you want to keep that as a background fact. This war cannot go on. So, but in any event, there's difficulty in the negotiation. Les Docteurs tells Kissinger very directly that his delegation is having trouble with their Politburo, and he has to go back to Hanoi to discuss it. He also makes it very clear that they're continuing, that he expects to be back. He's leaving his experts there to continue discussion, but he needs that clarification. Nixon and Kissinger decide that this is a moment that they could do some more damage. And so they institute the Christmas bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong. And they do it lying by saying, we have no choice. The North Vietnamese have broken off negotiations with us. We must do this to get them back at the table. That's not true. And they bomb, for 10 days. And their basic goal is to do as much damage as possible. Fortunately, most of the children of Hanoi have been actually evacuated. But, there's tremendous damage to civilians, including, homes that are shattered, just like what you're seeing in Ukraine, really.
It's a war crime, but go ahead.
It's just, the hospital in Hanoi is bombed. And, there's something else. I'm not sure if Hastings mentions this in his book, but the point is that in doing the Christmas bombing, Secretary Laird did not want them to do it at all. Reason is that North Vietnam's anti-aircraft capability has really improved. And so Laird says to Kissinger and Nixon, I hope you understand that we're going to lose 3 planes every time we send up 100. And they're going to get shot down. We'd have more prisoners there, more people dead. And incredibly, even the fact that it's clear that we're going to lose planes, that American pilots are going to die in this 10-day operation, that it's utterly unnecessary in terms of actually getting a peace agreement. Nixon and Kissinger just go on and do the 10. And then they said, well, we brought North Vietnamese back to the table. That's what we've done by our brilliant bombing. But it's war crimes. It's bombing civilian areas.
Yeah, the South was being intransigent, as you mentioned. But who could blame them? It was a secret deal that signed away their government. So these titanic battles take place in 73, 74, 75, massive engagements, huge casualties, but the U.S. is not really involved other than air power, which time and again saves Arvin, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, but for our purposes, the South Vietnamese Army. By the time Saigon's going to fall, finally, once and for all, the Congress says, that's it, no more. We're not going to bail out the South Vietnamese again. And Gerald Ford was not happy with this at first, but what could he do about it?
We will stand by our friends. We will honor our commitments. And we will uphold our country's principles.
Well, he couldn't do anything about it. And Congress also, I mean, in the immediate aftermath of the January 73 agreement, the U.S. is continuing to bomb Cambodia. And, primarily because the place is a total mess and they've destabilized everything and they don't want the communists to win. So they're back to bombing Cambodia. Congress cuts that off in the summer of 1973. But by the time that Gerald Ford is asking for more money, by then, the situation is totally lost. Yes. And it turns out to have been Nixon's good fortune that he was pushed out of office before that came. But, to me, I mean, one of the things that I think is really appalling is that Henry Kissinger, who's about to be 100 years old in May, has come through all of this, mostly unscathed. In 2002, when the question of whether the U.S. was going to go into Iraq, there's Kissinger again giving advice that we should invade Iraq. So my question is, why does somebody like that, who has the responsibility for so much suffering, so much hardship, so much death, and who never is called to account, and actually seems like a reasonable person to ask whether we should go into Iraq or not? I mean, to me, the 100th birthday of Henry Kissinger is really, a sign of a kind of moral bankruptcy that we have as a country. We want Putin to be accountable for what he's doing, right? We want the Russian leadership to do. This is war crimes that we're seeing. Yeah. Oh, they blow up people in apartment buildings. That's a war crime, right? We also blew up people living in Hanoi who are just trying to live their lives, and we're not accountable. We're not facing up to what we've done.
Yeah. So my last question to you, and I think you've already started to answer it, which is fine, is what are the wrong lessons then to draw from the Paris Peace Accords? Now, I'm always talking on my podcast about the right lessons, which means then you have to sort right from wrong. What are the wrong lessons here?
There's a lesson that has limited truth, which is that certainly the agreement was against the interests of South Vietnam. Do we call it a betrayal? Does the United States have a responsibility year after year to prop up a government that can't defend itself?
And was unpopular with...
in their own people. I mean, the fact is that at any given moment you look into this, our aid to South Vietnam far outstrips anything the Chinese or the Russians are giving the North. But, certainly when Nixon says we've accomplished all of our goals, which he says, and our allies are really fine with it, that none of that is true. It is disadvantageous to South Vietnam.
That's right. But Nixon, I'm sorry to interrupt, but he gives a speech once the peace accords are signed and official. And I think in a recent lecture you gave, you quote Nixon verbatim, and everything he said in the beginning of that speech was total baloney.
Throughout the years of negotiations, we have insisted on peace with honor. In my addresses to the nation from this room of January 25th and May 8th, I set forth the goals that we considered essential for peace with honor. In the settlement that has now been agreed to, all the conditions that I laid down then have been met.
It's total baloney. It's just like complete. Our allies are in accord with this when up until the last, 7 seconds, the South Vietnamese government is absolutely furious and don't want to sign. And basically Nixon tells them, if you guys don't sign, you're not going to get a cent from us. So this is it. We're going ahead. You come with us or not. But, to me, I think there's two lessons from this, really, which is, first of all, that the United States should not be sending troops to other people's countries. To send troops into other countries to try to determine what their government should be or what their economic arrangements should be. We should have learned that lesson in 1973. And maybe the horrors that we've experienced, especially in Iraq, might not have happened. So I think that's one thing that's important. I think a second thing that's important and which is applicable today is the really outsized influence of the military on our policy. as I said to you earlier, at the very beginning, like Nixon and Kissinger are being told by the military that the war is going really well. And if they just lean in, it'll be fine. Terrible advice from the military. I mean, this gets us to a whole other subject. Was it really wise for the United States, after the Cold War was over, after communism had ended in Russia, was the wisest policy what Bill Clinton did, not to end NATO or to include the Russians, which they were actually interested in, but to try to actually strengthen our military alliance and put ourselves in a position where we're even more at advantage over Russia, which is already profoundly weakened. Was that really the best decision that was being made? I don't think so. So I think the longer lesson is the role of the military in our life, which, by the way, is about to get $1 trillion for the next budget that they're asking for.
Well, the Vietnam syndrome, right? The United States should avoid this type of engagement. Well, the other side of that was we need to kick the Vietnam syndrome. We're now afraid of sending our troops anywhere. Reagan wanted to kick the Vietnam syndrome, and he did by sending forces to tiny Grenada. Really, the Vietnam syndrome, and this is an illusion, was ended in 91 with the first Gulf War. That we mastered war. We can win major engagements without losing many people, and it would be easy. And in terms of warfare, the defeat of Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait in 91 was relatively easy, but that proved an illusion.
And the policies that we put in place there. I mean, on the one hand, having him get rid of his weapons of mass destruction was, I think, a laudable goal. Don't want to discount that, but what was the hardship on civilians? How many children died?
Devastating sanctions, yes. Destruction of infrastructure, water purification, all of it. No, it's a depressing subject, Carolyn.
Well, it is a depressing subject, and right now we're in a very hawkish phase of American policy. The Democratic Party, if anything, is more hawkish than the Republican Party, and the influence of our military is as great as it's ever been. No, it's a difficult time, but I think, nevertheless, I think that the importance of diplomacy and peaceful solutions to problems remain as much of a goal now, it should be, as they should have been, 50 years ago.
Ms. Thomas?
What are the lessons of Vietnam in terms of the presidency, the Congress, and the American people, in terms of secret diplomacy and fighting a land war in Asia? Also, would you welcome a congressional inquiry into how we got in and how we got out of Vietnam?
Ms. Thomas, the war in Vietnam is over. It was sad and tragic in many respects. I think it would be unfortunate for us to rehash allegations as to individuals that might be to blame or administrations that might be at fault. It seems to me that it's over. We ought to look ahead, and I think a congressional inquiry at this time would only be divisive, not helpful.
President, may I ask you then, don't you think that we can learn from the past?
Ms. Thomas, I think the lessons of the past in Vietnam have already been learned. Learned by presidents, learned by Congress, learned by the American people, and we should have our focus on the future. And as far as I'm concerned, that's where we will concentrate.
Andrew Wells Dong of the U.S. Institute of Peace. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Martin. Glad to be here.
So let's start with some broad brushstrokes, if you don't mind, as we talk about the decades-long reconciliation between the U.S. and Vietnam. I'd have to say that it is relevant in our age of intractable wars and hatreds, when U.S. diplomacy seems to have been superseded by a very militarized foreign policy. What are your general thoughts on that premise?
Right. I mean, so the Vietnam War ended now almost 50 years ago. It's still an important touchstone in U.S. foreign policy and military strategy. And we've learned some things and not learned other lessons from that experience. In the case of Vietnam, for the first 20 years after the war, so until 1995, we didn't have diplomatic relations. We were isolating Vietnam, sort of continuing the Cold War aspect. And then U.S. policy changed and Vietnamese policy changed to engage with each other, to have normal relations. And that was led by people from both countries who took the lead in building those relations. So for the last now almost 30 years, it's been a very different kind of relationship where Americans and Vietnamese have come closer together and cooperated to address the legacies of the war and present day issues too.
It's
so
remarkable.
I think there are a lot of lessons there that we can apply to other conflicts that the U.S. has been and is part of now.
Absolutely. Iran, still no diplomatic relations. Cuba is another example, right? So instead of maybe asking what took the U.S. and Vietnam so long to normalize relations, although 20 years is not a long time, I guess the better question is, how did it happen at all? Given what happened during the war, the massive destruction wrought by the United States on that small country.
So the Vietnamese were ready to normalize with the U.S. quite soon after the war because they were in a situation having a war with China and Cambodia, needing economic investment opportunities. And they claimed all along that they didn't have a permanent conflict with the U.S., right? They just wanted the U.S. not to intervene in their own revolution. So there were steps to normalize actually in the late 1970s in the Carter administration, which fell apart because of U.S.-China normalization and then Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia. So that was one of the many missed opportunities, I think, in U.S.-Vietnam relations. But then it was the efforts of American veterans who went back, of Vietnamese who they met and established a rapport with, of Vietnamese Americans who went back already in the 1980s, of business people who traveled to Vietnam and wanted to trade. And they found that there were Vietnamese partners ready to work with them. And then in the context of the late 80s and early 90s, right, there were U.S. veterans in leadership positions in Congress who pushed for normalization. The major political issue at the time was how to account as fully as possible for U.S. missing in action troops from the war. And that seemed like an impossible problem, but then the Vietnamese started to cooperate with the U.S. and a joint MIA mission was established in the late 80s. And then an office opened in 1991. So that was actually the first official U.S. presence in Vietnam after the war.
Well, there were no POWs left over, despite what the Rambo movies made it out to be.
That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, this is the MIA issue. There were approximately 3,000 U.S. troops listed as missing at the end of the war. And over now almost 40 years of cooperation, close to half of that number has been identified and those cases resolved.
And to your earlier point about the war after the war, Vietnam did invade Cambodia to get rid of the Khmer Rouge regime, right? And then there was a war with China afterward. So Vietnam really didn't have peace until, what, the 1980s?
Yeah, the late 80s, right. And then they were affected by the end of the Cold War and collapse of the Soviet Union, which had been their main ally and protector since 1975. They had to adapt, and they did adapt, joining ASEAN, normalizing relations with most major powers, and setting up this foreign policy of being multi-directional and having partnerships with all neighbors and major trading partners, which has been quite a difficult balancing act, but they've managed to do it successfully.
When we think of Asia, especially Southeast Asia today from an American perspective, what do we think of? Textiles, clothing. It's a market for large companies, multinational corporations to put their factories at clothing manufacturing facilities.
Yeah, and as U.S. investment in Vietnam has increased, right, the U.S. is now Vietnam's largest export market, not only for textiles, but also things like furniture and seafood and coffee and products like that.
And there are controversies within those industries, obviously,
Sure, yeah.
because of the way
Everywhere.
workers are treated, etc. But yeah, the U.S. and Vietnam had to reconcile. As I mentioned, the United States perpetrated massive violence on a small country. But within Vietnam as well, Vietnamese, didn't they have to also reconcile with one another? Because when we talk about North Vietnam, South Vietnam, these were inventions. We're talking about a single people, the Vietnamese. Yet, because of the war, right, there were factions, there were discrete political entities involved here. There was a North Vietnam with a communist ideology. So can you talk a little bit about how difficult that was for Vietnamese to put their civil war behind them?
Yeah, no, that's all correct. The war was a political conflict between revolutionaries and anti-communist nationalists, right? It wasn't mainly a regional conflict between North and South. In fact, at some points in the war, the leaders of South Vietnam were Northerners, and the leaders of the Communist Party in North Vietnam came from the South.
Wow.
The majority of people in all parts of the country supported the revolution and Ho Chi Minh, at least initially. Most weren't communist, but they thought that the Viet Minh and later the Viet Cong, or National Liberation Front, represented the nation. So when the U.S. intervened on the side of the anti-communists, right, that was a minority, mostly in Saigon and Da Nang and other main cities. Most of the countryside was controlled by the revolution, which is what made it so difficult for U.S. troops.
Which was an indigenous revolution. It wasn't merely people coming down from the north along the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
That's right. And as you said, the leaders had a communist ideology because they had been part of the Comintern and were connected to China and the Soviet Union.
Well, they were
and had
nationalists
support from
too.
those countries, right? But most of the people who supported the revolution weren't communists. They wanted Vietnamese independence from initially the French and then later the U.S., who they saw as a continuation of the colonial power.
And even the Japanese, really, after
That's right.
immediately
During World
after
War
the
II.
Second World War.
Mhm.
Wow, what a story! What a terrible ordeal for one people to go through. Was it then difficult? Sorry, I interrupted you there. Maybe threw you off via your track as you were answering my question. Was it difficult for the Vietnamese to put all this behind them?
Yeah, it's been very difficult because the Civil War aspect, divided families all through the country, right? There were parts of the family that opposed the revolution and went south, and others that supported it or decided to stay in the north. In the south, right, some young men ran off to join the guerrillas, and others stayed behind and were drafted into the ARVN, the South Vietnamese army. So they could have ended up fighting each other. And then the level of loss and destruction was so huge, right? There's still over 300,000 missing Vietnamese from the war. And depending on your estimates, up to 3 million combatants and civilians who died during the war. So after reunification, right, the victorious communists put a lot of effort into memorializing their losses, while the ARVN, the losing side of the conflict, have no such memorials or state to back them, right, who looks for their MIAs. They were U.S. allies, but they're not recognized by the U.S. either, right? Their names aren't on the wall in D.C. So they feel rightly that they're being ignored and forgotten by both the U.S. and Vietnam. That reconciliation with present-day Vietnam, has to be led and run by the Vietnamese themselves. I think the U.S. can make space and help to facilitate it, but we can't determine it. But of course, that's part of U.S.-Vietnam reconciliation too, because there are now 2.5 million Americans of Vietnamese descent, and that's part of who we are as Americans.
Are they mostly people who fled Vietnam after the fall of Saigon?
Yeah, I mean, there were something like 700,000 refugees, right? So their descendants now are most of the Vietnamese in the U.S., but others have come more recently as students or to work here and stuff. So it's a diverse community.
So you say the thaw begins in the 80s and the 90s, and it was spurred by economic and political considerations. What about moral questions? Have the Vietnamese people forgiven the United States?
Immediate reaction or impression of almost all Americans who visit Vietnam, and this was true even in the 80s, right? Some of the earliest veterans delegations were amazed that they were really well treated. They were welcome. No one hated them for being Americans or blamed them for what had happened during the war. And that's still the case. If you look at opinion surveys for what they're worth, Vietnam has the highest positive impressions of the U.S. of any country in the world at the moment.
That's amazing.
In the upper 80%. Like 87%, I think, was the last survey.
Maybe ordinary people don't want to hate one another.
Yeah, they're able to see many positive aspects of the U.S., which they identify as a rich, modern country that they would like to emulate in some ways, right? It doesn't mean they want everything to be exactly the same, but
of course.
So I think there's that positive feeling that keeps on coming through from people. Forgiveness in the sense of when U.S. and North Vietnamese veterans meet, and I've been able over the years to observe and sometimes translate for those meetings. There's a feeling of we're all brothers. We were on opposite sides of this, but we don't blame each other for what happened, right? So, yeah, where does that forgiveness come from? And I don't think forgiveness is the same as reconciliation, but it's perhaps a step that leads towards it. It's the basis that, okay, now we can actually have a relationship as people despite the past.
Because as we know, wars don't end. They migrate to our minds, and civil wars are especially bitter and poisonous. I recently did an episode about the Confederacy, and I got some angry emails in my inbox from people asking me, how dare you suggest or say that the Confederates were traitors, which I did say about the Confederate leadership. And, you know, the usual stuff that you get from people. And there are still plenty of Americans who feel that way. Far fewer today than, say, 100 years ago, but they're still out there. It seems that maybe that's not the case.
Right. And yet, right, in the U.S., there have been Confederate war memorials and cemeteries since shortly after the Civil War ended.
There's some beautiful ones at Gettysburg where I visited last spring. And to me, that's where those statues and memorials belong, on battlefields or museums,
That's right.
not in the public.
But in Vietnam, that hasn't been the case, right? There is a South Vietnamese military cemetery that is now open, but is not maintained by the state in any way. It's up to individual families and charities to support maintaining it. So it's still very much forgotten and neglected. But it was a different conflict than the U.S. Civil War. So I think that,
Yes.
Each context does come out differently there.
Yeah, we'll return to whether this situation can be compared to others. I mentioned Iran and Cuba.
Yeah,
We'll return to
that's
that
right.
subject in a bit. You have said that the seeds of U.S.-Vietnamese reconciliation were planted not so much by governments as by ordinary people who had, in one way or another, directly suffered the traumas of the war. You began to answer this earlier. Maybe you can expand on that point right now.
Right. So if we think about how does the U.S. make peace, and is that different from how other countries make peace? I think one of the factors in this are American values that are in our Constitution and that we claim to subscribe to, implement perhaps inconsistently, but they're there. We can draw on them. Another aspect is the strength of civil society in the U.S., that if you want to think about who is actually putting U.S. foreign relations into practice, sure, it's the diplomats and the official representatives of the U.S. government, but it's also private citizens who are doing business, who are leading educational trips, who are visiting, who have relatives in that country, right? That's all part of the U.S. presence in a country.
Pop culture, too, Hollywood movies.
Yeah, all of that, right? Yeah. Given how our society is quite diverse and decentralized in that way, in a situation like post-war Vietnam, where there was this impasse between the governments, it was private citizens who took the lead. And what's remarkable here is the role that veterans played, right? So some of the people who had been drafted or volunteered to fight in Vietnam wanted to go back and, for their own personal reasons, as well as their social and political beliefs, to right the wrongs, or some of them, from the war, try to establish relations during peacetime. So that led to programs to clean up landmines, to make prosthetic devices for amputees from the war, a lot of projects to help children, to reduce poverty.
What about the defoliants that the U.S. doused the country with?
Yeah, so Agent Orange and the other herbicides is a more difficult problem because the effects of it are so widespread and yet hard to pin down. So, there were veterans projects to help disabled children early, even in the 80s and 90s. But it took until the mid-2000s for the U.S. government to get involved, both in the environmental cleanup of some of the contaminated, mostly military bases where the defoliants were stored, and then to support programs for people with severe disabilities, which include those affected by Agent Orange.
So as you know, there's a lot of talk today about a U.S.-China Cold War, a potential hot war coming down the road. So therefore, the U.S. is seeking to bolster its relationships in the Indo-Pacific. How would you describe Vietnam's relationship with China today, and how does that relationship affect how the U.S. is trying to maintain its hegemony in that region?
Right. So if you ask Vietnamese people, right, they can point to history of how they've resisted the Chinese over centuries. This cultural and historical background, I think, was underappreciated by the U.S. during the war, who saw Vietnamese and Chinese communists as a monolith. and that was never the case. But perhaps now we could overemphasize it if we think that Vietnam and China are always opposed to each other. That hasn't been the case either, right? There have been plenty of periods in history where they've worked together and there's been a lot of trade and exchange and so on. So it's more than just this public view of China. There's also the economic ties between the countries. If China shuts the border gates, that puts thousands, maybe millions of Vietnamese farmers in dire straits. Then there are the ongoing connections between the ruling parties of both countries, right, which are still communist in name. But then on the other side, China's aggressive actions in what Vietnam calls the East Sea, or we call the South China Sea, where there are direct conflicts of sovereignty there. So it's a very complicated relationship. And from the standpoint of Vietnamese leaders in foreign policy, sure, they don't want to take sides for or against China, that's clear. But they also see that China is right on their doorstep, on their northern border. That's a different relationship than they have, say, with the US or Europe that are thousands of miles away.
The U.S. punishes countries whose governments we don't like Cuba, right? Iran, although I don't want to boil it down to something as simple as that. A lot has happened since 1979 that has reinforced the bad blood from the Islamic Revolution. But what I'm trying to get at here is Vietnam is a communist country. Communism is anathema to the United States. But is it communist in its politics and more capitalist in its economy? How would you describe that dynamic?
Yeah, it's Leninist in its political system, right? It's a one-party system that's led by the Communist Party. There's no legal opposition, and critics of the party are treated harshly. Economically, though, it's no longer a Marxist economy. There's still a state role in the economy, but that's no different from any other countries in the world.
Did that help facilitate a better relationship between the U.S. and Vietnam when Vietnam opened up its economy?
Yeah, that was part of it for sure. I think the lesson here is that it's not that Vietnam's political system has changed and that's why we have better relations. It's more that the U.S. was able to see the value of better relations despite the fact that our political systems are different. And there are still many things about the Vietnamese system that Americans differ with. And this has been made clear by President Obama, Trump, and now Biden, that we respect Vietnam's different political system. We're not trying to change it. And we have a normal relationship that we can partner with them, right? So why has that been possible in the case of Vietnam, while it hasn't with several of the other countries that you mentioned?
That's a tough question because every situation is different.
That's right.
But we can learn something from the reconciliation between the U.S. and Vietnam, that maybe intractable conflicts can be solved somehow. I mean, in my preparation that I shared with you, talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, well, that involves two peoples making claims to the same piece of land. That's different. India and Pakistan over Kashmir, I mean, that's much different than the U.S. and Vietnam. So I guess the comparison does have its limits.
Yeah, I think the comparison is really with other U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, or long-term political conflicts such as with Iran and Cuba, as you mentioned, places where the U.S. in the past had supported unpopular dictatorial rulers. In the case of Iran, even we overthrew a democratic government to put the Shah in place. And then those rulers were overthrown by anti-American extremists like Khomeini and Castro. And of course, every situation's different. But if we take an approach looking at Vietnam, and I'm referring now to a talk that former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel made at USIP last year, what are our national interests here? Can we be clear on what those are? What are the political objectives behind the use of military force or sanctions or other policies that we're putting forward? And do we understand the culture and history behind it? So those are questions I think if we apply to other contexts, we might be able to find a path to normalization.
Well, as you know, politics gets in the way. So when the Obama administration tried to have a more sensible, sane relationship with Cuba, he was attacked by the right wing. In 1995, when President Clinton, who had, of course, been accused of dodging the draft in Vietnam, when the Clinton administration finalized the normalization of relations with Vietnam, was there a backlash in this country?
Well, there was bipartisan support from Vietnam veterans, the role of John McCain and John Kerry and others, right, in the Senate helped to enable it to happen in the first place, right, and then to keep Clinton from backtracking. Right. I mean, among Vietnamese in the U.S., there were and are some who did not support normalization.
Just like with Cuban exiles in Florida today.
Right? Over time, that's become a much smaller group as more and more Vietnamese in the U.S. have themselves gone back to Vietnam, done business there, still have family there. It's become less of a concentrated force. So that now really both parties are in favor of U.S.-Vietnam relations. It's not a partisan issue anymore. It's an area where we see a common interest. So I think that's unusual in this current context in Washington and something we should celebrate and aim towards elsewhere.
And the U.S. normalized relations with Mao's China in the 70s. The world benefits when there are more exchanges between countries rather than the status quo, U.S.-Cuba, U.S.-Iran. Not to get too preachy here, but any final thoughts on this?
At this point in Washington, right, there's a lot of discussion about defending democracy.
Yeah.
And that applies clearly in a case like Ukraine, right, where we want to support democratic allies who are under attack from authoritarian neighbors. But elsewhere in the world, right, our allies are not all democratic, or our partners and friends. And we also need to find ways to work with countries that have imperfect political systems that are not the same as ours, and yet we have common interests with their people. We have historical connections that we want to take responsibility for, and geopolitics comes into it as well, right? How can we work together with countries that are like-minded in some ways and be practical on that? So I think that the U.S.-Vietnam relationship is an example of how that can work.
Andrew Wells Dong of the U.S. Institute of Peace and Carolyn Eisenberg of Hofstra University. We are indebted to you. Make sure you sign up for my newsletter at historyasithappens.com. Every Friday morning, you'll get an email from the Washington Times written by yours truly. Coming up, future episodes, we're going back on location to Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. That's coming up in a little bit, early in May. Up next, Anatol Lieven on his reporting trip to Ukraine, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.